If you take your Bibles and turn to Nehemiah chapter 13. Nehemiah chapter 13. We're the very last chapter of our series. And if you don't have a Bible, there are some black Bibles in front of you. They are, and our passage can be found on page 480 of that black Bible, of the black Bible there. So we've gone through Ezra and Nehemiah. And in this series, we've seen this cycle of return from exile, basically ruin from exile, return to God, a renewal, a commitment to actually follow God, and then a regression to sin and ruin again. So God's people had moved from exile. They were set free by God from their captivity. And what was happening here is that, and they were set free for the purpose of restoring worship of God by the people of God for God's glory and for their joy. But the one thing, as you've followed us through this series, as you've noticed, is that they seem to never ever learn their lesson. It's kind of like teenagers, right? You know, if you've raised teenagers, maybe you're a teenager, you're not far from being a teenager, you seem to have to tell them time and time again to do something. Make your bed. How many teenagers here make their bed every day? How many adults don't make their bed every day? Yeah, there you go. All right, yeah. Well, you're still in the college lifestyle. You don't care. Why make it? You're just going to sleep in it again, right? You know, and that's kind of what we see. We see that, why is it that age group we have to tell them 5 or 6 times to do the same thing? Well, what we see is that that's just life. We go through and we look at the Old Testament and we read the Old Testament. We don't see an angry God that wants to judge and punish his people. But no, we see a God who is loving and patient. Because if you followed what Israel has done, even just in these 2 short books that we've been over the past several months, you've seen this idea that despite the sin, despite the continued rebelling, despite the continued failure over the same things, day in, day out, year in, year out, we see that God was patient and loving. And he redeems them. So in this series, we've seen that they've returned from exile after 70 years. And the promises of Jeremiah are coming true. They rebuild the temple. They reinstitute and make a commitment to follow the law, to do what God's commanded. And Nehemiah has come to rebuild the city. And last week, we saw this idea of what it means to be joyful and jubilant before the Lord. And today we come to the final episode in the book of Nehemiah. We look at it and we sit there and say, well, why doesn't the book just end in chapter 12? And they lived happily ever after. Well, the thing is that real life isn't a fairy tale. You can't go and sell a cow and get magic beans and get a magic goose to lay golden eggs. No. Real life is not just about a happy ending. It's about having to live where we are and having to deal with the real problems. What we see in this chapter is that they've gone from commitment to follow God, to worship at the temple, to make sure that the temple and the sacrifice, to pay their tithes, and also not to marry outside of the Hebrew race. Not to marry the unbelieving nations around them. They dedicate the temple, and then we see Nehemiah goes back to Persia, and 15 years later he comes and he sees the same things happening time and time again. So that's why I entitled this sermon, Restoration Unfinished. Because we, as people of God, will never, ever reach the point of perfection. We will never, ever reach the point to where we have no restoration left until Christ comes. We have been saved by the grace of Jesus Christ. We've been released from the penalty of sin, and we are being released from the power of sin, and we're becoming more and more like Christ every day. But it will not be until Christ returns, or we go to Christ, that the presence of sin will be out of our life. And that's what we see here. We see in this passage that the fundamental truth that our efforts are never enough to overcome our sin or our ruin in our life. We must have the grace and the mercy of God in our life and allow that to work. And peace only comes not from our efforts, but accepting and applying Christ's efforts that's on the cross. So what we're going to do, instead of reading this all at one time, we're going to read it and we're going to kind of go through it a little bit at a time. So to understand where we're at is that for 12 years, Nehemiah has been in Jerusalem. And in those 12 years, he took 52 days to build the wall. And then there were some other reforms, and he puts in systems and governors and everything else in place, and he sits there and says, well, it's finally time for me to leave. Time for me to go back to my job as the cupbearer of the king. I've set everything up. I've done everything that God has called me to do here. It's time for me to go. And so that's kind of where we see at the end of chapter 12 to the beginning of verse 13, we see that everything that's happening here is while Nehemiah was there. And then he goes back to Persia for about 12 to 15 years. And then again, the king releases him to go back to Jerusalem. So that's where we find ourselves. Look at verse 6. It says, in verse 6 there, it says, while this was taking place. So after everything, what was happening is that while he was in Persia, things in Jerusalem were not going well. Everything they had committed to do in chapter 10, in less than 15, in about 12 years or so, they began to go against that. They began to forget what they committed. So that's where we see, that's kind of the timeline when we're at here. So there's a 12 to 15 year hiatus between the first part of 13 and also verse 6. And it says, while this was taking place, I was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I went to the king. And after some time, I asked to leave of the king and came to Jerusalem. And then I discovered the evil that Eliashib had done for Tobiah. So he comes back, and right away, Nehemiah was faced with the sin. Nehemiah was faced with a ruined city. And think about this. Nehemiah was thinking, well, I left everything. The temple had been rebuilt. Ezra was here, had reinstituted the Mosaic covenant. They committed to follow God, and they signed on the dotted line. The temple was there for them to worship, and they committed to worship the temple, do the sacrifices, support the priests. They said that we're not going to intermarry with those outside of the Jewish faith. And then what happens is that he comes back, and it didn't matter all the stuff that he had done for them. It didn't matter that everything was there for them to follow God. Little by little, they drifted away from their commitment. And what we see here is that the real problem that the Israelites have, the real problem that we have in our daily life, is that the problem is not our surroundings. The problem is not that God hasn't given us what we need to follow him. The problem is us. It's our hearts. The hearts were sinful. This experience in chapter 13 tells them that despite everything that God had given them, they have chosen to sin in the same way that they had done before. Apparently, the disaster of 70 years in exile did not accomplish the transformation of the human heart. Even the grave consequences that they had experienced while they had come back in the 100 or so years since they come back, they did not learn their lesson. Israel's problem before the exile was a hard heart that resulted in rebellion against the terms of their covenant with God. And Israel's problems after the exile, it was exactly the same. I think that's why we see in today that when we, as a society, when we try to deal with crime, when we try to deal with abuse in families, when we try to deal with poverty or whatever hardship or suffering that people may have, what we try to do is we try to change everything on the outside, thinking, oh, if we could only give them a better home, that would work. If we could give them better parents, that would work. I think that would be helpful. If we could only give them a little bit extra money each week, that could get them by. But what the Bible tells us, what Ezra and Nehemiah shows us, that it's not just about the things on the outside. It's about what's on the inside that counts the most. So what we see in this chapter is we see the three ways that they go against their covenant. We see this, the first thing we see is that they forsake the worship of the temple. Worship forsaken. They ignore the Sabbath. And then we see the problem of pagan families, that the Jewish men desired unbelieving women instead of their own God-fearing women themselves. The very three things that time and time again in these two books that they had done. So let's look at this very quickly, but I want to look at it a little bit closely. Look at verses 7 through 14. And this reads, it's really interesting how Nehemiah reacts to this. Look at beginning with verse 7. It says, "And I came to Jerusalem and then discovered the evil that Eliashib had done for Tobiah, preparing for him a chamber in the courts in the house of God. And I was very angry, and I threw up the household furniture of Tobiah out of the chamber. Then I gave orders that they cleanse the chambers, and I brought back the vessels of the house of God, and the grain offering and the frankincense. I also found out that the portions of the Levites had not been given to them, so that the Levites and the singers who did the work had fled each to the fields. So I confronted the officials and said, 'This is the house of God forsaken. Why is it forsaken?' And I gathered them together and set them in their stations. Then all Judah brought the tithes of the grain, wine, and oil into the storehouses. And I appointed as treasurers over the storehouses Shalmaniah the priest, Zadok the scribe, and Pedaiah the Levites, and their assistants Hanan, the son of Zachor, the son of Mattaniah. And they were considered reliable, and their duty was to distribute to their brothers." In verse 14, he goes and prays, "Remember me, O God, concerning this, and do not wipe out my good deeds that I have done for the house of my God and for his service." So Nehemiah comes back, and the first thing he notices is that in the temple, we're not priests. In the temple, there was no sacrifices going on. There's no worship, but instead, it had become an apartment. All the things for worship had been taken out, and the very enemy of God, Tobiah, had moved in. So what was happening is that the people stopped stopped supporting the Levites and the priests. And they eventually said, "Hey, I've got to feed my family." So they go out and begin to farm and begin to do other work, and left the temple uninhabited. And the Jerusalem officials say, "Hey, we need to do this. Let's rent it out." So it would be equating, sitting here saying, you know what? Instead of this being a church on Sunday, we're going to clean everything out, and this is going to be a bar to compete with the Honey Honey. Oh, it's going to be, or usually what happens is that when a church closes up shop, what does it become? Number one, it becomes a coffee house, an antique store, or a brewery. Well, I think it would be a brewery, because this was it. The very enemy of God, the Tobiah, the family that came and was set there, and as they built the temple to try to stop the building of the wall, They let him in, and they let him take over the most holy place in all of Jerusalem. What does Nehemiah do? He doesn't go and knock on the door and say, "Excuse me, Tobiah, you need to move." No. He bursts into the door, he throws Tobiah out, and he takes all of his belongings and throws them all in the courtyard. And then he brings in everything else that needs to be here and cleanses the temple and says, sacrifices need to start again. So we see that it didn't take generations. It took probably 10, 12 years for them to falter in their commitment to God. Not only was that, but then look at the next set of verses. Verses 15 through 22. In those days, I saw in Judah people treading wine presses on the Sabbath, and bringing in the heaps of grain and loading them on donkeys, and also wine, grapes, figs, and all kinds of loads, which they brought into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. And I warned them on the day when they sold food. Tyrians also who lived in the city brought in fish and all kinds of goods and sold them in the Sabbath to the people on Judah and Jerusalem itself. Then I confronted the nobles of Judah and said to them, "What is this evil thing that you are doing, profaning the Sabbath? Did not your fathers act in the way, and did not our God bring all this disaster on us, on the city? Now you are bringing more wrath on Israel by profaning the Sabbath." As soon as it began to grow dark at the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I commanded that the doors should be shut and gave orders that they should not be opened until the Sabbath, after the Sabbath. And I stationed some of my servants at the gates, and no load might be brought in on the Sabbath day. Then the merchants and sellers of all kinds of wares lodged outside Jerusalem once or twice. But then I warned them, and I said to them, "Why do you lodge outside? If you do so again, I will lay hands on you." From that time on, they did not come to the Sabbath. Then I commanded the Levites that they should purify themselves and come and guard the gates to keep the Sabbath day holy. Remember this also in my favor, O God, and spare me according to the greatness of our steadfast love. So we see that the second grievous sin was that they began to ignore the Sabbath. And you say, well, what's so big about that? Why is it so big about selling and buying on the Sabbath? How many of you went and got a coffee today or went to McDonald's or whatever on the way to church? Well, you guys aren't heathens. I feel bad because I went to Arrowhead and got a coffee this morning. How many of you guys are going out to eat afterwards? No? Okay, all right. So what we need to understand, what was the big deal about the Sabbath? We kind of talked about this in the past. This was a commitment that God wanted the people of Israel to do. We saw this in our series on the Ten Commandments. Remember the Sabbath day and to keep it holy. It was that the people of Israel were not to do any work. Their animals were not to do any work. They were not to cause anybody else to do any work. And why was that? It was so that they would put their trust in God. That they would work 6 days a week and they would rest and trust in God on the seventh day. So from Friday night to Saturday night was a time of rest. Now today we're not living under that law. We're living under the new covenant. We are living, Christ has accomplished, he has completed all of the Mosaic law. His death and resurrection, and Christ is our Sabbath rest, as it says in Hebrews. So I did not feel guilty going and buying some bacon and also buying a cup of coffee at Arrowhead this morning. Because we are not, and number one, Sunday is not the Sabbath day. That would have been Saturday. But that's what was happening. The very thing that put them into exile hundreds of years ago for 70 years, then losing their land, losing everything, they are doing it again. The reason why they were in exile, they lost everything in the first place, was because they chose to ignore the Sabbath. They chose not to trust God and ignore the Sabbath. And we see here in verse 17 that Nehemiah blamed the leaders for not enforcing the Sabbath, for allowing the practice of business on the Sabbath day. He called it evil. Violating God's law is evil. So what did Nehemiah do? He commanded the gates to be shut from Friday night as it was getting dark, and it would not reopen until after the Sabbath day. Then he placed his own servants as guards, and then eventually trained the Levites and the priests to guard the gates. And then those non-Jewish unbelievers that were wanting to sell their goods to this new city stood outside hoping that eventually they get to go in. And what does Nehemiah do? He says, I will beat you up. I will lay a hand on you if you do not leave. Well, they didn't think he was serious the first time. So they came back again. But after that, they kind of did not come back on the Sabbath day. So what happens is that when strike two, the things that they committed to do, they are re-offending. And then thirdly, we see in the last part of 23 to 29, we see one of the scourges that they had. Look, follow with me. In the days also, in verse 23, I also saw Jews who were married, women of Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab, and half of the children spoke the language of Ashdod, and they could not speak the language of Judah, not only the language of each people. And I confronted them and cursed them, and beat some of them and pulled out their hair. And I made them take an oath in the name of God, saying, you shall not give your daughters or to their sons, or take their daughters for your sons or for yourself. Did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin on account of such women? Among the many nations there was no king like him, and he was beloved by his God. And God made him king over all Israel. Nevertheless, foreign women made even him to sin. Shall we then listen to you and do all that is great and evil, to act of treachery against our God by marrying foreign women? So and he says, one of the sons of Jehoiada, the son of Eliashib, the high priest, was the son-in-law of Sanballat the Hornite. Again, an enemy of God. Therefore, I chased them from me. Remember them, O my God, because they have desecrated the priesthood and the covenants of the priesthood and of the Levites. Thus I cleansed them from every foreign thing and established the duties of the priests and Levites, each in his work. And I provided for the wood offerings at the appointed times and for the first fruits. Remember me, O God, for good. So we see that Nehemiah comes back and sees that even the high priest's son had married foreign women. And what does he do? He makes them take a covenant of not allowing that to happen. Now, this was, if you remember, how did Ezra deal with this in the book of Ezra? He made all of those who had married foreign women to meet with them one-on-one. And if those foreign women or foreign spouses did not come and have faith in God and renounce their own false religion, then they would be sent away. They would have to be divorced and be sent away. They would be taken care of. But what does Nehemiah? Nehemiah doesn't do this. It doesn't tell us why. I was talking with Ryan about this morning. It's probably because the time period is that it was only one generation that was a problem. And he basically says, hey, guys, if you want to mess up, you've already messed up your own life. Don't mess up your kids. So make a commitment not to allow your daughters to be married to foreign men, and also your sons to take foreign women. It had become such a problem that the children could not speak Hebrew. Why was that such a big deal? Well, if they did not know Hebrew, they could not participate in the worship of the church, of the temple. If they could not speak or read Hebrew, they could not read and understand God's word. You know, it'd be like living today in a time to where we have a family. Now, there's nothing wrong with having families that are multilingual. There's nothing wrong with interracial marriage because this has nothing to do with our identity of God's people. The reason why it was such a big deal there was he gave the example of Solomon. That the reason why Solomon started out so well but ended so terribly is because of the women he loved. He married people from foreign lands and decided to follow their religion instead of his own religion. Instead of the true God, he worshiped the false gods. And I think that's what happens today. Today, we as believers, it doesn't matter what nationality we are or who we marry, as long as each one of the spouses are believers. But he sits there and says, this is what is causing you to fall away from God. And it doesn't matter how many systems or places or good things happen, the problem is your heart. And that's exactly what we see here. And you know, the problem is that we see here in this chapter that what God's people need wasn't a new temple, wasn't a new city wall. They needed new hearts. This is the purpose of Ezra and Nehemiah and the overarching storyline of the Bible. The story shows that the return of many Israelites to Jerusalem was only one step towards the fulfillment of the prophetic hope of the new covenant in the kingdom of God. The full realization of them to be able to follow God was not necessarily a restoration of the Mosaic covenant. That was passing away. Jeremiah the prophet had said hundreds of years before that a new covenant was coming. And God was preparing his people to say, this isn't going to cut it. A new Messiah was coming. It was better than Ezra, better than Nehemiah. And what we see that God is faithful. That despite their sin, God was gracious and loving towards them and gave them good leadership. But despite their sin, despite our sin, God is patient, he is loving, and he prepares grace, and he prepares for us, and he gives us the generous gift of God's grace through Jesus Christ our Lord. So the real problem we see is our hearts. So it doesn't matter if you have everything else, if you have everything else in line, if we don't take care of our hearts, our lives are going to be a mess. We may be able to fake it until you won't someday, but how do we find peace in our life? How do we allow restoration to be complete? It's about having a relationship with Christ, not just trying to do it yourself. But the other thing we can learn from this is that we should all accept biblical correction. You know, the sins of the people were great. The situation was grave. And what does Nehemiah do? Was he polite and says, hey, you need to fix this? Or, all this is going to happen? No. Nehemiah dealt with the problem head on. Look what he does. Look at verse 8. So, and it's kind of every sin that he encounters, it kind of, escalates. I was very angry, and I threw all the household furniture of Tobiah out of the chamber. So he saw that the temple was being desecrated. What does he do? Does he just knock on the door and say, hey, excuse me? No, he takes care of it. He was a one-man moving machine. It wasn't two men in a truck. It was one man and the lawn, and the temple lawn. And he didn't do it privately. More than likely, everybody was watching this. It was like a Jerry Springer show that was going on here. This is what was happening. And then we look at Nehemiah 13, 20 through 21. Then the merchants and sellers of all kinds of wares lodged outside Jerusalem once or twice. But I warned them and said to them, why do you lodge outside the wall? If you do so again, I will lay hands on you. That's the reason why we have Ryan, who's an associate pastor here. If you need to be disciplined, I'm going to send him to the door, knock on the door, and take care of you. Because I'm going to take the next one. Look at verse 25. This is good. And I confronted them and cursed them and beat some of them up and pulled out their hair. Wow, we sit there and say, well, Nehemiah, isn't that going overboard? Yeah, I'm going to beat you up if you don't listen. If you fall asleep in church, that's it. You're going to be bald and you're going to be bloodied and bruised. Now, we are all called to offer what we see here and what we see in the New Testament is we are all called, each one of us calls is to offer biblical correction when it is needed to others. And also we're all called to accept biblical correction from others when we're needed. We see this all over in the New Testament. Now, I don't think it's necessarily this physical. The Bible never tells us in the New Testament that if a brother sins against you, you beat him to a pulp. You know, it doesn't say that if he dents your car, you wreck his car. You know, it's not that idea of revenge. But we do see this idea of spiritual and verbal warning throughout the New Testament. We in Galatians 6:1, brothers, if anyone is caught in any transgression, you are spiritual, should restore him in a spirit of gentleness. No, not beating, you know. We live under a different covenant. And Nehemiah, you know, and I think that's what we see. You know, sometimes sit there and say, well, is this really what God wanted? 3 times, at each time he dealt with sin, he's asking God to lead him, to remember him, to protect him as he deals with the sin. Matthew 18, this idea of church discipline, that we are to first go, it's a progress that if someone offends me, or if I offend you, you are to come to me and say, hey, pastor, or so-and-so, this is what you did. And then if that person doesn't listen, then you bring some other people inside to help the process. If not, then the whole church should listen. 2 Thessalonians says is that we should not regard our people as enemies. But when people sin, we should regard them as a brother, to help them, to warn them. 1 Timothy says, for those who persist in sin, rebuke them in the presence of all, so that the rest may stand in fear. Titus 3 says, as for a person who stirs up division, after warning him once and then twice, have nothing more to do with him, knowing that such a person is warped and sinful, he is self-condemned. So what we see here in Nehemiah was that these sins were so grievous that it wasn't only hurting themselves, it was hurting the people of Jerusalem, it was hurting their families, and it was hurting the whole nation. Because their identity was all wrapped up into these 3 areas that they had gone back on their conviction to follow, their commitment. And even today, I think what we need to understand is that since our problem is our heart, and while we may seem like we have it all together on the outside, we should lovingly correct those that are going astray. When we see somebody straying from the truth of Scripture, we are to lovingly go to them and say, hey, brother, hey, sister, I'm concerned. I'm concerned of the decisions you're making are not ones that a Christian or a follower of Christ would make. And you try to correct them. And even James in chapter 5 says, if anyone among you wanders from the truth and brings him back, there's a blessing to that. Not only do you save yourself, but you save a soul, possibly from hell. But one thing that we see in Nehemiah and Ezra is that we need a better builder. We need someone better than just Ezra. We need someone better than Zerubbabel. We need someone better than Nehemiah. And that's what this book is pointing to. And we have one in Jesus, who says in Matthew 16, I will build my church and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Jesus is that better Nehemiah. Nehemiah is the chapter in the unfolding story of God's redemption of all creation. Because of its chronology in redemptive history, it serves the important function of pointing us towards Christ, who is yet to come, who is a better builder, who leads his people home from spiritual exile, who builds a structure of living stones. Not just a temple, but he builds a temple himself. We are his temple. The presence of God resides in us, not in a building. It was never meant, these books are never meant to be about the leaders, Ezra and Nehemiah, but it was about Christ. It is pointing to Christ. And this is why when Nehemiah prays in the first chapter, thanking God for redeeming his people. Yes, he was thanking God for redeeming his people back in Egypt, back from slavery, and also back from Babylon, from exile. But that rescue pictures the greater one to come, not through the blood of a sacrificed lamb, but through the death and resurrection of Christ, our Passover lamb. What we see in Ezra and Nehemiah is we see a God who keeps his promises, who keeps his covenant. And we, in this side of the cross, we look back and we see Jesus as the promised one we see in the new covenant. You see, Jesus is the cornerstone to build your life upon. We shouldn't build our life upon our identity as who we are, but Jesus is the cornerstone. He's the one that we need to build our life on. It's not about our job. It's not about our education. It's not about our family. Psalm 18:22 says, "The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone." Paul in Romans 9:33, talking about this very passage in Psalms, says, "As it is written, behold, I am laying in Zion a stone of stumbling, a rock of offense, and whoever believes in him shall not be put to shame." And that's what we see as we come to the end of Ezra and Nehemiah, is that it shows us the history of a point in time of Israel, how they're coming out of exile and trying to restart about living under God's promises and God's covenant. It shows us that God is faithful, and it shows us how people are failures at following the covenant. Why? Because the issue is not about a temple. The issue is not about a city. It's not about a wall for protection. But it's about the greatest need that Israel had and that we have today, is that our hearts need to be changed by Jesus Christ. You see, we don't need a temple. We don't need a wall. We need to have God's love written on our hearts through relationship with Jesus Christ. And that is what we see here. And as we are coming to sing our final song, we need to understand that what Ezra and Nehemiah tell us is that our hope is not found in having all the structures and everything perfected, but it's about following God and having faith in his Son, Jesus Christ. And that's what we have here today. That it's about becoming more like his Son by first and foremost having our heart changed, by repenting of our sin and believing that we have a relationship with God through Jesus Christ our Lord. But it's also about, once we do that, it's about this process that it's not that, I've prayed the prayer, I've walked the aisle and I haven't made, I'm good, I don't need to do anything else. No. It tells us there's a process and there's a cycle that we will continue to grow more and more like Christ. And we will do that not at a steady rate, but we will do that in points of celebration over sin, and then also regression back into sin. And then return to God, and so on and so forth. And our relationship with Christ, with God, will be rocky because we are unfaithful. But God is always faithful. He is always loving, and he is always forgiving. So with that, let us stand and sing.